welcome to the CSAE conference. It's a kind of a slightly unusual format this year. Instead of having all of you come to Oxford and have a bit of fun for 2 or 3 days, we decided to kind of spread the conference over 2 weeks, have kind of specific themes for each day. So the good thing is you can follow all the papers presented. So if you want to spend 2 weeks listening to papers, you can, which is great fun. But so today we have an exciting program of political economy paper. We're going to start now with a series of papers on conflict and violence. So we're going to start kind of in a minute. The format is basically, we have 4 speakers. Each of them is going to speak for about 15 minutes, all after the other. And after that, we're going to have a chance for a little bit of a Q&A session. To submit your questions, use the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll kind of then allow you to ask the questions later on. The questions are only going to be kind of visible to me as the chair and to some of the panelists, but they will be reviewed carefully, and then we'll select the ones to ask. The thing I want to flag is the session is being recorded, so as soon as you speak, your face is going to come live, and we will, this is going to be visible on the internet. If you don't want that to happen, you can just kind of ask your question and tell us when you ask your question in the chat, and I can just ask that question, so that doesn't become an issue. So kind of let's not waste any time. And so why don't we ask James Fenske to start presenting it.
All right, thank you. So what we're going to ask in this paper is exactly what the title suggests. We're going to ask whether the introduction of new crops from the New World to Asia after 1500 increased the incidence of conflict there. Why would we want to study such a broad period and such a broad geographic scope in a single paper? Well, because a lot of the evidence we have on how productivity shocks, say commodity price shocks or rainfall shocks, affects conflict comes from rather transitory short-run variation and looks at short-run responses to short-run variation. A big exception to this being recent work by Nunn and co-authors. And so if we were to consider a different context, one in which productivity shocks are permanent and one in which we observe changes in conflict over the long run, how would things differ? This also has implications for the understanding of economic development. If conflict between Asians made European imperial expansion easier or changed how Asia related with the rest of the world through trade, this could help us explain the Great Divergence and why Europe pulled ahead. So what we're going to do in this paper is go out to what's effectively an encyclopedia of conflict, Jacques 2007. And we're going to take all the conflicts that he lists that happen in Asia, and we'll take the UN's definition of Asia here. We're going to geocode them, and we're going to map them into a panel of 1 degree by 1 degree grid cells, so that we can change the size of the cell if you want. We're going to observe these every century, though we can change the time period if you want. We're going to merge these cells with data on the suitability of every cell in the world for the cultivation of various crops. And we're going to take the calorie-based measures from Oded Galor and Omer Ozak, and this will give us a measure of potential crop yield for every cell in the world, both before and after 1500. So from that point on, the difference in difference becomes obvious. We're going to do both diff and diff and event study specifications, and we're going to show the grid cells that became more suitable for agriculture because of the Columbian exchange, because of the exchange of crops from the old world, or from the new world to the old, saw increases in conflict, and this includes civil conflict. Are these big? Well, it looks as though the typical cell gained the ability to produce about 1.1 million more calories per hectare per year. And that increased conflict by a number that is pretty close to the mean within the sample. We're going to kick this around a fair amount, and we're going to argue that the main mechanism supported by the data is one of rapacity. That is, the gains from holding any particular grid cell rose due to this rise in productivity. So it isn't as though there's only one type of conflict that matters, and it isn't as though there's only one type of crop that matters. So if you think this is about taxability of cereals, that could be part of the story, but it will not be the whole story. It is driven largely by South Asia, which was, compared to other parts of Asia, relatively densely settled, relatively diverse, and home to many competing states on the eve of the Columbian exchange. We're going to not show you, but tell you about heterogeneity analyses in which it's the more diverse cells that respond more to the gain in suitability due to the Columbian exchange. And we're going to do formal mediation analyses that show you that rising populations, rising urban populations, and to a lesser extent, the spread of the British Empire all respond to caloric potential and seem to drive conflict. So the regression we're going to run is going to be a rather obvious difference in difference. For any grid cell, 1 degree in latitude by 1 degree in longitude I, in any given century t, and we're going to start in the century beginning in 1000 and we're going to end with the century beginning in 1800, we're going to regress the number of conflict starts that we observe in that cell on the caloric suitability index, CSI, for that cell in that century. We're going to control for time invariant variables by allowing them to have differential impacts before and after 1500. We're going to have grid cell fixed effects, and we're going to have century fixed effects. So the variable that might be most unfamiliar is going to be the Galore-Ozek caloric suitability index. It's only going to have 2 values for every grid cell in the data. It's going to have 1 value before 1500 and 1 value after 1500. That change is going to be based on the fact that before 1500, you can only cultivate old world crops in the old world, but after 1500, new world crops become available. The controls that we're going to include are going to be rather standard in this literature, and we're in the baseline, although of course we can do things like Conley standard errors as well, we're going to cluster by grid cell. Where are we going to get data? Well, our baseline measure of the left-hand side variable is going to come from a well-known Encyclopedia of Conflict by Jacques. You've seen this source used before, for example, by Joachim Voth in a Restud paper. We're going to take every event that happens in Asia in this source, and we're going to geocode it by the nearest settlement. We're also going to geocode a number of other characteristics on the basis of these encyclopedia entries, including the type of conflict, whether, say, it was a siege, when it happened, how long it lasted, who took part, and where the capitals are of those states, if they are states, and if they have capitals. That's going to give us a bit over 1,300 conflicts over the course of almost a millennium. And then because this might not be a complete source, we're going to go to other sources we have that my co-author has collected for a number of other projects, and we'll be able to, for robustness, we don't want to mess with this in the baseline, add non-overlapping conflicts from these other sources. And so you can see both where conflicts happen before and after 1500 in our data. For example, you can see the Crusades in our data, you can see the start of feudalism in Japan in our data, but after 1500, you can see the spread of the Mughals, you can see the unification of Japan in the data. In terms of the right-hand side variables, we're going to use the Galore and Ozak data, and these are going to be an improvement over past measures of land quality that you might have seen in this literature. Why? Because they're not measured in kilograms, and they're not measured on a scale from 0 to 1. They're measured in calories. And so Galore and Ozak go out to the FAO's GAEZ data, which tells you what you can expect to produce. These are potential measures, not observed output measures, based on low input, no canals, no irrigation, kind of the most exogenous measure of potential you can get due to soil quality and climate. Because a kilogram of potatoes and a kilogram of saffron may not be the same thing, Galore and Ozak convert these into caloric variables. They go out to the US Department of Agriculture, find out how many calories there are in a ton of any given crop, and then tell you how many calories of any given crop can likely be produced in a given grid cell. They report 2 values, one before 1500, using only the crops that were available in one part of the world, and then another value after 1500, using the full suite of crops. On the basis of that, they can tell you what the potential output is using the optimal crop, the calorie maximizing crop, in any given grid cell. They're going to be reported on a raster grid, and because latitude and longitude, well, because longitude gets closer together, the closer you get to the poles, I can't give you a clear mile by mile number, but at the equator, it's about 6 miles by 6 miles. We're going to aggregate these up to 1 degree by 1 degree grids. And so the change over time in these is largely due to New World crops. Which New World crops are important in the Old World and are contributing the most in terms of calories? Well, beans, cassava, coconut, groundnuts, maize, sunflower, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, and what I grew up being told was called potatoes. In terms of which one is most important for calories in most cells, maize is going to be the calorie king in our data. And so you can see gains in caloric suitability, particularly in northern India and in northern China, as a result of the ability to produce New World crops in our data, moving from before 1500 to after 1500. So the main result, what I'll show you, is a regression of conflict starts in century I, in century T, in grid cell I, first, just in caloric suitability, which varies over time due to the Columbian exchange, controlling only for century fixed effects and grid cells fixed effects. To control for potential tree trends, we can take the suitability for old world crops, allow that to vary with post. If you don't want us to look at all conflicts, but instead civil conflicts, we can use that as a dependent variable. And if you want us to take our time varying controls and interact them with post, we do that in the bottom panel. What you see looking across left to right is a positive coefficient with some stars. What does that mean? Well, it means that a 1 million calorie per hectare increase in caloric suitability, that's our base unit. And if that sounds arbitrary, you can think of that as the calories needed to feed one more adult male in a given hectare in a given year. That raised conflicts by about 1/25th of a conflict in a century. That's a number that's relatively close to the mean in our data set. If you don't want to think in those terms, you can think instead in terms of standard deviations. One standard deviation increase in caloric suitability increases the amount of conflict in a given cell by a number that's about half the standard deviation of conflict. Because the coefficient magnitudes are about half for civil conflict what they are for all conflicts, we say that about half this effect comes from civil conflicts. And the coefficients get a little bit bigger when you add controls, so we don't think that that's driving anything. If you want to see the event study, this is the event study. Not only does conflict really only take off in cells that are suitable for New World crops after 1500, it looks as though the effect is slow to kick in, and this matches what we know from the secondary historical literature on the diffusion and the speed at which New World crops diffused to the Old World. If we want to think about possible mechanisms, go back to the classic Dalbo model. It doesn't look like the opportunity cost effect, a rise in the value of being a farmer rather than a fighter, is driving our results. That would work in the opposite direction. So rather, it looks as though rapacity, rising returns to controlling any particular grid cell, that must be what's driving our results. And so it could be that being able to produce more calories in a given grid cell makes any cell a bigger target. It's got more people you can tax. It's got more urban people you can tax. Maybe it just makes land more valuable. And so both Asian and non-Asian states would want to gain control of these. We could also imagine that urbanization and population lead to more interactions between people. And if any given interaction has the potential to spark conflict, that's another way through which population and urbanization could serve as mediators. We expect this to be particularly the case in places where both diversity across groups and diversity within groups can lower social cohesion and can serve as the basis of coalitions that are useful to organize when you want to have a conflict and appropriate economic gains. So I won't show you the 2 minutes?
Just 2 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, I won't show you the heterogeneity analyses in this table, but it looks as though several crops matter, and it looks as though several types of conflict respond, but the results are largely driven by South Asia, which is a densely settled urban environment with a lot of population heterogeneity and a lot of competing states in 1492. It looks as though it's the more diverse cells in the data, either measured by heterozygosity or by number of ethnic groups, that are responding most to caloric suitability. In terms of mediation, I can put things like urbanization on the left-hand side or population density on the left-hand side. those are going to respond positively to caloric suitability. If I put them on the right-hand side, they don't fully explain away the coefficient on caloric suitability, but this falls. And it falls by a percentage that looks as though each one on its own explains perhaps 15 to 20% of the impact of the Columbian exchange. The British Empire, which we can measure either at the country level or at the grid cell level using the Geocron database, cells that gained caloric suitability were more likely to end up in the British Empire. The British Empire also predicts conflict, but this has a much smaller effect on the coefficient. It is a mediator, but it is a less important one quantitatively. So what do I think we've told you? I think we've told you that either in a diff and diff or an event study, areas of Asia that became able to produce more calories due to the Columbian exchange were subject to a greater incidence of conflict. The effect size is meaningful. It's something like half a standard deviation, and it looks like it's driven by rapacity. We've shown that population density and urbanization are mediators that pop out quantitatively importantly from the mediation analysis. The British Empire also statistically shows up, but doesn't explain effects that are as large. I haven't shown you in this talk, but we've looked at other possibilities, like whether New World crops mediate droughts, whether states are built in response to higher caloric suitability, or whether greater inequality explains the results, and we think we can rule those mechanisms out.
Great. Thanks a lot, James, for being bang on time. Very much appreciated. Hopefully it sets the tone for the rest of the day. So now it's Victoire's turn to talk to us about our research.
Thanks, Julien, for this introduction, and all of you for being here today. It's a pleasure to present this joint work with Malek Fourati and Jérémy Laurent-Lucchetti on how armed groups members may end up using sexual violence in a conflict setting in response to the value of natural resources. Why did we start working on this? Well, there's a huge literature on the resource conflict nexus in development economics. And one aspect that more the policy side called our attention to is the question of conflict time sexual violence. So the 2018 Peace Nobel Prize to Nadia Girard and Dr. Denis Mukwege calls attention to the hundreds of victims of these forms of violence. And if we follow the intuition of the Dr. Mukwege, it's actually a form of violence that can be used by armed group members as a means of annihilating local population in resource-rich areas. So this is basically what we are testing in this paper. And in famous example aligned with this idea is that of the Ndjuma Defense Group of Congo, who in the summer of 2010 raped close to 400 civilians in the resource-rich Walikele territory, leading a local leader to conclude after the attack that the minerals are our curse. And this group, got renamed after in 2017, was still levying taxes in villages under its control under the form of mining permits, mining output taxes, agricultural taxes, and other forms of taxes. There's evidence of such sort of taxation strategy and sexual violence used to enforce taxation around natural resources from various countries. And it really concerns hundreds of thousands of victims. If we look only in the South Kivu province of the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2007, it's estimated that it was 48 women being raped in the region every hour. To be sure about what we're talking about when I talk about conflict time sexual violence, it's very different from intimate partner violence. So it's any harm of a sexual nature inflicted in a conflict setting. And the typical example would be a gang rape performed by armed group members. Whether this is a systematic byproduct of war, as some have argued it might be a spoil of war, something that you observe in every conflict, seems a bit difficult to defend, as it's observed actually in approximately half of the civil conflicts since 1989, which raises the question of why and where does it take place? And is it the case that, aligned with the intuition of the Dr. Mukwege, we observe these rapes for resources, that the presence of local natural resources actually motivates the perpetration of sexual violence by armed group members? That's the question we're asking. The very short answer to it is yes. go a bit more into the detail of where this answer comes from, well, we try to put together a bit what could be the mechanism behind what is at play from a theoretical standpoint. I will try here to give you very briefly the intuitions that we have here. If you consider two actors, that would be an armed group and civilians in a weakly institutionalized region, where the armed group, if you imagine an armed group, will use violence as a taxation strategy, as a way to extract resources from the local population. So in this sense, this paper is very well aligned with the one that James just presented. We observe predict the standard predatory effect, where the increase in the price of the resource should increase the use of violence. However, if really the violence is motivated by taxation of the resource, the type of violence that we observe should depend on the characteristic of the resources to be taxed. And this leads us to provide a broader typology of violence, where for labor-intensive resource, as an armed group, you want to preserve the local labor. So you have incentives to resort to non-lethal rather than lethal forms of violence. Moreover, next to this labor intensity of the resource, we also consider the question of the concealability of the resource, which is to which extent for a civilian population, it is easy or not to hide away the resources that are being produced from taxation. And here, this means that as an armed group, if you want to tax the resource, you will have to exert more effort and more violence over the population if you want to be able to tax the resource. So our main prediction is actually this idea that labor-intensive and easy to conceal resource should lead to non-lethal violence. Why is this our main prediction? Because based on the evidence available on sexual violence, conflict time sexual violence actually are overwhelmingly a non-lethal form of violence. Okay, so then once we're equipped with this theoretical background, we want to test it with ideally quite fine-grained data on the incidence of sexual violence and the value of local natural resources. We combine this in a panel of cells covering the African continents. These cells appear here in gray, so it's cells that are 0.5 degrees longitude and latitude, that is 55 times 55 kilometers at the equator. And we have observation for these cells over 21 years, thanks to the latest version of the ACLED. And the latest version of the ACLED also tells us in each location and in each moment whether there has been a record of an event of conflict time sexual violence. And what this map shows you is for each cell, the number of years over the 21 years in the sample when the cell has at least one event of sexual violence being recorded. Some cells have just 1 year where they have such events of sexual violence, others have up to 11 years, so a majority of the number of years in the sample. And we then cross this information on conflict time sexual violence with information on what are the local natural resources that are present and the value of these natural resources. We consider 3 different types of local natural resources that are artisanal minerals, industrial minerals, and agricultural products. For artisanal minerals, we focus on gold because this is the main source of employment in the artisanal sector in Africa. And it's data that I actually collected with the geologist Guillaume. I'm very happy to discuss further later. What this data tells us is for each cell, whether it lies above a geological layer that is prone to hosting gold that can be mined artisanally. We then have, and this data was important in this project. Why? Because artisanal gold is the caricature example of a resource that is labor intensive and easy to conceal. You need people to work in artisanal mines, and gold nuggets are very easy to hide away from taxation. We then can contrast whether the presence of this artisanal gold is going to have the same sort of relationship to conflict and sexual violence as other sort of local natural resources, namely industrial minerals, where we update the data that is used in Berman and Coulter for the 2017 paper in the American Economic Review, and which tells for each cell what is the main mineral being produced industrially in that cell, which also means that as gold is one of the main minerals in their database, we're able to contrast the result for artisanal gold and industrial gold. And the last resource that we consider is agricultural resources with the suitability of a cell for different sorts of crops. And we here consider only cells that have a minimum suitability of at least 40% or more, so that the cell can actually have decent yields for the crop for which it is most suitable. And for each of these spatial source of variation, we then attribute variation in the global prices of each resource. So over the red cells here, you will have the international price for barley, while in the case of artisanal mines, you will have the international price of gold. It is a source of exogenous time variation. If we put all this data together in a very raw first overview, we obtain the following graphs. Looking at the left panel, what it shows us is here in gray, what is the incidence of sexual violence in cells that host artisanal mining. So all the cells that were in yellow in that map. Okay, what's the average incidence of sexual violence for each year in these cells? Oh, sorry, that were not in yellow, that were in white. And in black, we have the average incidence of sexual violence for each of the cells that are in yellow and black, so that are prone to hosting artisanal mining. While the dashed line tells us what is the international gold price over the period. And we can see that there's a clear discrepancy appearing between the incidence of sexual violence in cells with and without artisanal mines, and that this discrepancy appears to follow with a few year lags the international gold price. If we perform the same sort of descriptive exercise for cells that have no industrial mines or industrial mines, there doesn't seem to be a clear discrepancy following the price of industrially mined minerals. Similarly, for agriculture, there is no clear discrepancy following the price of agricultural products. This is a very rough first overview. We can then move to a more standard framework where we consider the incidence of sexual violence in cell I in country T at time T, and we relate it to the value of the artisanal mining activity, of the industrial mining activity, and the agricultural activity, controlling for a rich set of fixed effects that will account, among other things, for the institutional setting in a given country, whether there's a conflict going on in that country, and even actually at a finer level than the country, also in the level of the ethnic homelands. So what are the sort of armed actor present in a given ethnic homeland a given year, or what are the local gender norms in that ethnic homeland in that given year, so we allow them to be time varying. And also, of course, the cell and year fixed effect account for the type of resources that are anywhere present in the cell, whether your cell where you live is a place that is prone to hosting artisanal mining or any sort of crop or industrial mining. What this means is that we identify our effects of interest through a within resource panel variation coming from the exogenous changes in the world commodity prices. And based on our theoretical framework, what we expect is that we should observe a positive coefficient for artisanal mining, because artisanal mining is this caricatural example of a labor-intensive and easy-to-conceal resource, while we should observe a null or negative relationship between industrial mining and sexual violence, and null or positive relation between agriculture and sexual violence. And moving to the estimation, this is exactly what we observe, whether we introduce resources in a staggered manner or altogether. We also check, I believe these two important things to check that I will mention here. First, that what we observe here is not mediated by the relationship that exists in general between resources and violence. We know, for example, that there's a clear relationship between the price, the value of industrial minerals and battles, and maybe as being a byproduct of this battle, this would play a role in our results if we observe the same relationship for artisanal mines. What we can do here is to control for the incidence of battles or for other sorts of violence recorded in the ACLED, any sort of violence recorded in the ACLED, which is not sexual violence. And we can see that our coefficient of interest stay perfectly stable. So what does this tell us is that, yes, battles and other sorts of violent events recorded in the ACLED do have a positive relation to the incidence of sexual violence. You could say that there is this kind of byproduct spillover effect of other forms of violence on sexual violence, but the relationship we identify between local natural resources value and sexual violence incidence is independent of this relation to other forms of violence. A last thing that is really important to discuss here is this idea that sexual violence is not just like any other sort of violence, as awareness of it may have changed over time. And to lay this, we don't believe that this is an important question in our results. Are we focus on a very specific time of conflict and sexual violence result in a public event? We rest on this very detailed level of variation at the country, homeland, and year. And any bias should have to be linked to local resource price and vary by method of extraction, that we obtain almost opposite result for artisanal gold mine and industrial gold mine. However, we can push further and levy our theoretical model that tells us, that gives us prediction more generally on the drivers of lethal violence and non-lethal violence, not just sexual violence. So we build up proxies. I will spare you the building. It's a bit rough. I don't want to be hands on the table here, but we build up proxies from the ACLED on what are forms of non-lethal violence by armed groups against citizens and lethal violence by armed groups against citizens. And we can
Victoire?
see that we have, yes.
Sorry, you have like 1-2 minutes left.
Perfect, thanks. And we can see that we observe similar results for the relationship between artisanal gold mining value for sexual violence, other forms of non-lethal violence, and altogether. And that this labor-intensive and concealable resource is the main driver. While if we move to industrial mining, they are the main driver of lethal forms of violence, which is perfectly aligned with our different theoretical prediction. A last result I would like to show you is if really these forms of violence is used as a taxation strategy, we would expect that actors that need local resources to fund themselves are the ones to react more to the value of these local resources. And actors who need the most to fund themselves locally are rebel groups. And we can see that even, indeed, rebel groups, when you have a rebel group presence in a given cell and year, rather than state forces, no ACLED actor or other forms of actors, the rebel groups are the ones who react most. Let me conclude here. The value of natural resources does appear to shape the perpetration of sexual violence. Theoretically, the sexual violence should increase with the price of a labor-intensive and concealable resource. And this is what we confirm empirically, as sexual violence appears to take place in artisanal mining cells when the price of gold increases. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Victoire. That was kind of really, really interesting and super clear. So now we're going to move, I think we're going to stay in Africa, and we're going to move to Eoin, who's going to talk to us some of his recent work on pastoralism and climate change.
Thank you. So can we all hear and see okay? Thumbs up? Okay,
I can,
so I say to my students, thank you for the thumbs up. Okay, so this is a paper called Transhuman Pastoralism, Climate Change and Conflict in Africa. It's joint work with Nathan Nunn. And we'll begin with two fairly straightforward facts. Okay, so civil conflict in Africa, as everyone in this session knows, it's pervasive and it's costly, and it's important to understand what's causing it. And the second fact is that many parts of Africa are becoming much drier due to climate change. So we're broadly interested in this question of whether climate events contribute to conflict in Africa, and if they do, how and why exactly. Okay, so there seems to be quite a few survey papers in recent years sort of calling for more work on these precise mechanisms to link maybe climate change related conflict events or climate change related weather events to conflict in Africa. So that's where we come in. We're going to test one very specific mechanism linking drought to conflict between two types of ethnic groups. The first is transhuman pastoralists, who I'll speak about in just 2 seconds. And the second are sedentary agriculturalists, also known as farmers. Okay, so Africa has a very sizable pastoral population. Maybe about 22% of Africa's population obtains the majority of their income from animal husbandry, right? So that's what we define as a pastoral a pastoral person or pastoral group. So that covers about 43% of Africa's landmass. So many of these pastoral populations are also what's called transhumant, which means that they are seasonally migrant. So through these seasonal migrations, they're going to regularly interact with sedentary agriculturalists. And what we're going to show today is that these relationships seem to be very, very sensitive to the effects of climate change. So a little bit of background before we go on. So for most parts of Africa, there are two main seasons, and the seasons are defined by precipitation, not by temperature. Okay, so you have the wet season, which is self-explanatory, and that's where the growing is going to happen, and you have the dry season. So this is an example of the wet season in the northern hemisphere, right above the equator. This is average rainfall in the month of August over about 70 years. And you see a high concentration of rainfall here, and it's much drier in the southern hemisphere. And then we swap over to a dry season month from the perspective of the northern hemisphere, and we see there's just some precipitation left here in the coastal area, and much drier conditions elsewhere in West Africa. So during the wet season, in a typical year, transhumant pastoralists are going to graze their animals here. So these will be pastoral lands. And this is more marginal land, but despite being marginal, there is still enough phytomass, enough plant biomass produced in the wet season to sustain the animals here. At the same time, sedentary farmers are going to be down in these sort of agricultural lands here. This is more fertile land. And so during the wet season, this is when they're going to be cultivating their crops. Okay. So after the harvest, once we're finished with the wet season, the pastoralists are going to move down to the agricultural area. At this point, the agricultural area is no longer being used for cultivation. And this is a sort of traditional symbiotic arrangement that's going to suit both groups. Okay, so for the pastoralists, their animals are going to be able to graze down here in the agricultural land during the dry season. So even though it's the dry season, there's still enough phytomass being produced in this more fertile land to sustain the animals. And then on the other side of it, the benefit to farmers is that the animals are going to break up the ground, and they're going to provide organic fertilizer, right? Nitrogen-rich organic fertilizer. So this is what a typical year is going to look like. This transhumance, the seasonal migration, is going to be a cooperative equilibrium. It's going to suit both groups. And at the end of the dry season again, the pastoral group is going to head back north again, back to these marginal lands where hopefully there'll be enough precipitation to again sustain their herds. Okay, so this movement is what's going to be characterized by sort of a typical precipitation year. Just to show that we're not making this up, here's some sort of rough estimates of some transhumance routes in West Africa. So the clear arrowhead is the direction during the wet season, and the solid arrowhead is the direction in the dry season as they come down. So weather climate change. So these are precipitation anomalies in the Sahel from 1901 to 2017. And one thing that's very clear here is from about the mid-1960s onwards, these anomalies become negative, right? We have a lot of droughts, persistent droughts and severe droughts kicking in towards the end of the 1960s. Okay, so this is what climate change looks like in the region. Okay, and the sort of point of this paper and what we're testing is this idea that climate change is disrupting this symbiotic relationship between both groups. Okay, it's changing the optimal timing and location of these transhumant movements. So more specifically, what our hypothesis is going to be is that adverse rainfall shocks or droughts on pastoral lands are going to force the pastoral groups to migrate earlier than they otherwise would. They're going to migrate towards the agricultural land before the harvest. And because they're migrating early, that means you're going to have competition for resources. So what might this look like? Animals might damage crops. There'll be competition for water, competition for pasture. Okay, and this is what's going to make conflict emerge. So here's a couple of photos from a dissertation by Apong Amankwa. We see here in the first figure, a maize farm destroyed by cattle in Agogo in Ghana. And then we see the retaliation down here, which is cattle killed by the unknown, by the farmer involved. So looking at this, it looks like it's a very small conflict event, but the point here is that it escalates, and it escalates very quickly and very seriously. So here's an article from Foreign Affairs from a couple of years ago, the deadliest conflict you've never heard of between Nigeria's cattle herders and farmers. Okay, here's a BBC article, and now we're in Mali. This is conflict between settled Dogon people and Fulani herders. And then finally, here's an example from Time magazine. And the Time magazine example sort of explicitly brings climate change into the equation, saying that climate change is putting more pressure on resources and that that's ultimately what's fueling this conflict between farmers and herders. So that's where we come in. We are going to see if we can move from these descriptive accounts to more systematic evidence. Do we see this happening in the data? And our main research question, so if I get through nothing else, I hope to get through this main research question: do adverse rainfall shocks in pastoral areas cause conflict in neighboring agricultural areas? Okay, so we're interested in this very specific spillover mechanism. Is the shock happening in a pastoral area leading to conflict in a neighboring agricultural area? So one thing about sort of having this ex ante mechanism specified is that we can really dig down on the mechanism. I don't know if I'll have time for this, but hopefully I'll be able to show you that the effect of rainfall is operating through phytomass, which is plant biomass growth. The effect here, the conflict should be occurring in the wet season before the harvest and not in the dry season after the harvest. And we're going to do a placebo check with temperature, which is not the first order determinant of phytomass. And if I have time, and this being CSAE, maybe I won't, but we'll see if we can discuss a few political economy factors. Specifically, we don't see this effect happening when pastoral groups share more political power. Okay, so that's telling us something about the balance between grazing rights and cultivation rights that seems to be achieved when political power is shared at the national level. Okay, straight into the data. So at this point, it should be fairly routine. We're on the 0.5 degree cells like Victoire. We have 10,000 of these cells covering Africa, and we have a 30-year period. What's important just to sort of plant in our minds now is that we have cells with the subscript I are going to be nested within ethnic territories, which we'll donate by E. Our conflict variable is just going to be an indicator for the incidence of conflict in a given cell year. We're going to prefer the UCDP data because that covers 30 years, but we'll also show what happens using the ACLED data as well. Okay, so how do we measure transhuman pastoralism? So there are 3 steps involved. First step is we want to measure transhumance, the seasonal migration. So for this, we're going to use information from the ethnographic atlas. The variable V30 tells us something about the mobility of ethnic groups. There are 2 ways to do this. So for the whole paper, we'll show what happens either way. We could do this narrow version, which is just taking the most mobile groups. And we can do a broad indicator, which takes into account every group that's mobile. Okay. So for the purposes of today's talk, I'm just going to show you what happens when we use the narrow part, or the narrow definition of transhumance. Okay, the second part, how do we measure pastoralism? So here we're going to borrow the index of pastoralism that was used by Anke Becker in her Restud paper. So this is the share of subsistence that an ethnic group derives from animal husbandry times whether or not their primary animal is a herding animal. So typically this would be an animal larger than a pig, an animal that's suitable for herding across long distances. And then step 3 is just putting this together, okay? Putting transhumance and pastoralism interacting both together. And that's going to give us an ethnic group level variable that we're going to call transhuman pastoralism. So here's how this looks across space. That's using the narrow version. This is using the broad version. Okay, so sort of either side of the Sahara, right across the Sahel, Horn of Africa, down by Namibia. We can check to see if this makes sense. We can sort of plot this, or we can map this over the distribution of land suitability for nomadic pastoralism, sort of just using ecological data based on climate and soil. That's what we're doing on the left-hand side here, and we see that it maps on very well. So the ethnographic atlas idea of transhuman pastoralism seems to map very, very well over ecological data predicting land suitability for transhuman for transhuman pastoralism. On the right-hand side here, we're just showing the suitability for agriculture. So agriculture is sort of filling the gaps in between. There are some areas that are suitable for both as well. Okay, so let's start with a simple cross-section regression before we get into the main specification, at least until Julien tells me to hurry up. So here we're just asking a very simple question in the cross-section. We're asking if transhuman pastoral neighborhoods are more violent. So is there more violence in an area beside a transhuman pastoral ethnic group? So the outcome variable here is our incidence for conflict in cell I in ethnic group E at time t. This is our main treatment variable for this associational cross-sectional regression. So this is the THP score, or the transhuman pastoral score, in the ethnic territory that's the nearest neighbor to cell I. So for each cell, we identified the nearest neighboring ethnic group. That's going to be the nearest neighbor. So this is the THP score of that nearest neighbor. And then we're going to control for the THP score of ethnicity E in which cell I is nested, okay? And then we're going to control for population mechanically and year fixed effects because this is a cross section. And then we're going to cluster standard errors. We're going to double cluster them by cell and by climate zone year. So just to give you a sense of the structure of the data, let's take these two cells here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. So we're in the Messina group. So for this cell, the nearest neighbor is the Zenega. And the Zenega is a nomadic territory. For this cell here in the same group, the nearest neighbor is the Bambara, okay, which is not a nomadic territory. So we can just put the average conflict over these cells, and we see in this top cell, there's more conflict than in the bottom cell. So this would be sort of a cherry-picked illustration of what we're testing in this cross-sectional regression. Okay, so we'll move from my cherry-picked version to more systematic evidence. So what is this telling us? This is telling us that your nearest neighboring THP score has a large positive association with conflict in your cell, whether we're using our narrow definition of transhumance or the broad definition of transhumance down here. Okay, so now moving on to our climate events. So we're looking at rainfall. We have rainfall data at the 0.5 degree cell year level. We're using rainfall for two reasons. Firstly, it's the first order determinant of phytomass, of the plant biomass that animals are going to survive on. And we also have nice variation across space, so we can identify this sort of spillover effect from a neighboring area controlling for rainfall in the cell itself.
Ian, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So here's our main specification. We have our conflict indicator again. Here's average rainfall in the nearest neighboring ethnic territory. Average rainfall in the nearest neighboring ethnic territory interacted with the THP score of that neighbor, okay? So that's capturing the differential effect of rainfall experienced by a neighboring ethnic group that is transhuman pastoral. We're controlling for rainfall in the cell's own ethnic group, in the cell itself, interactions with THP scores in the group and in the cell itself. We have cell fixed effects, we have country year fixed effects. That's going to control for lots of determinants in the literature. So here's our main result. So here's rainfall in the nearest neighboring ethnic group, how that affects conflict in the cell. And here's rainfall times the THP score in that nearest neighboring ethnic group. So we see a large negative effect on all types of conflict, on conflicts involving the state, no effect on conflict not involving the state, and a strong effect again when we use ACLED data. To give you a sense of the magnitudes, a 1 standard deviation decrease in rainfall experienced by a pastoral neighbor increases conflict by about 39% of the mean if we're looking at any conflict, 57% if we're looking at state-involved conflicts. Okay, there's the usual sort of battery of robustness and sensitivity. Let me just jump to the mechanisms. So according to our mechanism, the rainfall should affect conflict on agricultural lands rather than non-agricultural land. It should operate through phytomass, which is plant biomass growth. It should affect conflict during the wet season, not the dry season. And we shouldn't see as large an effect with temperature, which is not a first order determinant of phytomass. So very quickly, here's agricultural cells only. We see the same effects. Non-agricultural cells, we don't see the same effect. Here's our phytomass rather than rainfall. So this is satellite data on plant biomass growth that varies over time. We see results that are almost identical to the rainfall results. Here we have wet season conflict in the first 2 columns, dry season conflict in 3 and 4. It's all happening in the wet season before the harvest. Here's combining those two using phytomass and wet season. Again, that's where the effect is concentrated, not in the dry season. And here we're using temperature, which as I said, is not the main determinant of phytomass growth. What's interesting here is temperature, as expected, has a very strong direct effect on conflict. So temperature in an area causes conflict in an area. So whatever mechanisms are linking temperature to conflict, they're not explaining our story, right? We're not seeing the same spillover. Julien, do I have 30 seconds or am I done?
You're kind of done, yeah.
I'm kind of done. Or let me just summarize this and say that when pastoral groups have more political power, this effect approaches zero, to the extent that when it's at the 75th percentile, we don't see the effect at all. Okay, so it's telling us something that national level political power, or the right balance of power, can avoid this conflict.
Great. Thank you, Eoin. That was kind of a bit rich at the end, but very useful. Also, lots of interesting stuff to think about. So now we're going to move to Thorsten, who's going to conclude this off before we have a bit of a Q&A discussion in 15 minutes. Thorsten, over to you. Great.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks a lot to the organizers. I feel very important. This paper is co-authored with Tatiana, who's with me at UBC in Vancouver. And initially, the radical feminist in me wanted to call this paper Empowering Women by Killing Men. And in the sense, that is the paper in a nutshell. But my colleagues suggested, I should maybe not go that way. So it's called Yes, They Can, Genocide, Political Participation, and Female Empowerment. So let me tell you what we do. So to get you interested, have a look at this picture. This is a picture of the Rwanda National Parliament, recent. And you should notice two things. Number one, they're beautifully dressed. And number two, they're all women, almost all women. 67% of the members of parliament in Rwanda are female. That is world record. If you look at the World Bank Economic Forum that calculates these indexes on gender equality, Rwanda ranks about 5th, just behind the Scandinavian countries, right? I mean, you can't beat Iceland, maybe in soccer, but not when it comes to gender equality. So in this paper, we're going to ask, can war and genocide lead to female empowerment? And we're going to focus on the Rwanda genocide. Here's Rwanda, tiny country in Africa, where the Hutu majority, an ethnic group, killed big parts of the Tutsi minority in just about 100 days in 1994. After the genocide, 800,000 people were dead, and it potentially created huge gender imbalances that we're going to exploit. There's a challenge. Conflict does not break out randomly. So if we were to take our socioeconomic outcomes and just regress them on conflict, we'd probably not be getting it right. And so to get around that problem, we'll exploit exogenous village level variation violence. I'll tell you in a second what that is. We'll match it to household survey data some 15, 20 years after the genocide. And then we'll estimate the effects on various socioeconomic outcomes and hopefully, if we have time, discuss the mechanisms. So before I tell you about the exogenous violent variation, I want to introduce you to two types of perpetrators that were active in the genocide. The first one are what I call external army or militiamen. These guys were highly trained, better equipped. Think of them as the one on this picture. And the second ones were more local perpetrators. These guys were often civilians, local militia, local politicians, local civilians, often equipped with machetes, clubs, less organized than these guys, okay? So those are the two types of violences. And I'm going to, for the first part of the paper, I'm going to give you variation in the first type, okay? So the army and the militia was sent around the entire country during the genocide. And what I'm going to exploit their transportation cost, okay? They did not fly, they took buses or trucks, and so they were affected by the road condition. And in particular, what I'm going to exploit is an instrument set up of distance to the main road, right? So once these militiamen left the main road, they were on dirt roads, which are hard to travel on when it rains. And then interact that distance with rainfall along the way between each village and the main road, just during the 100 days of the genocide, right? And so the intuition is once you leave the main roads, which are in reasonable condition, you are on dirt roads, dirt tracks, and they're harder to travel on when it rains, okay? So just give you a quick preview of the findings. We find that in places with a lot of external violence, these guys, women do better across the board. Better, richer, healthier, wealthier, more physical autonomy, more sexual freedom, less domestic violence, you name it. And the mechanism that we're going to stress is the following. The militia targeted predominantly, I'll tell you in a second why, adult males, okay? That opened up a power vacuum that women filled, as household heads or politicians, and that enabled female empowerment. And I'm going to rule out a bunch of other stuff. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. Usual setup. So let me give you a little bit of background. There were two main ethnicities in Rwanda, the Hutu, about 85%, the clear majority, and the Tutsi, about 14%. And many argue that it was the Belgians and the Germans who sort of created the tensions between the two groups by explicitly favoring the Tutsi minority. Okay, so up to the 1960s, the Tutsi were the elite. That changed when the Hutu gained power with independence. A lot of Tutsi fled the country or were killed. And then up to the genocide, the Hutu were in power. There were times of conflict, there were times of stability, but tensions were always there, okay? And so in April 1994, the genocide starts, lasted about 100 days. Estimates suggest more or less 800,000 people died. It was planned by Hutu extremists. There was never a foreign intervention. And it ends with the RPF, the Tutsi rebels, the rebel leader being the president now, Kagame, who defeated the Hutu army and the militia groups. Okay, so it lasted very shortly, just 100 days. And just to make it clear that I'm going to look at two very distinct types of perpetrators here. Well, the external army militiamen, these guys are coming from outside of the village. They're going to be affected by the instrument that measures transportation costs. Those are people like the National Army, the Presidential Guard, Interahamwe, Imputzumagami militia. And then local perpetrators are already in the village, local policemen, local militia, etc. The data is pretty straightforward. We use DHS data. There are surveys in 2010, 2015, so about 15 and 20 years after the genocide, and we're left with 660 villages. If you wonder what a village is, there are these light gray lines would constitute villages. This is the data on the number of militiamen, the number of perpetrators, both local guys and external guys. So unfortunately, I don't have them separated. I only have them together. I use rainfall data from the NOAA, high spatial resolution, 0.1 degrees, which is important because Rwanda is a relatively tiny country. High temporal resolution, so it's daily, so it allows me to confine variation in the instrument to just those 100 days of the genocide. And then there's a bunch of other data. If you're interested, you can have a look at the paper. It's explained in more detail. So let's get to the empirical strategy. This is the way I construct the instrument. I take a village, I find the centroid, I find the closest point on the main road, I calculate the distance, I put a buffer around that distance, I calculate rainfall over that buffer, and I interact the two. I'm just using rainfall during those 100 days. And so this is the empirical strategy in pictures. Here you have a road, a dirt road. You know, it's dry. You can imagine driving there and arriving on time. And when it rains, you know, there are potholes, you get stuck, you might have to dig yourself out. So the bottom line is it increases travel time and it increases travel costs. Okay. Now you might say, wait a second, you're interacting distance to the main road with some measure of rainfall. That's going to pick up a lot of stuff, right? Access to markets, education, health, agricultural output. And so I have to control for a bunch of things. So this is here the instrument, stylized picture. The most important control is going to be the same interaction, but instead of using those 100 days in 1994, I'm using long-term average rainfall 10 years back. That takes care of general living conditions. If there's a place that always receives a lot of rainfall and is far away and is sort of far away from health centers, education centers, etc., a place that's doing poorly, I'm going to pick it up with this control, okay? And obviously I'm controlling for all the main effects, the distance by itself, the rainfall by itself. I'm also controlling for rainfall in the village, which might have an effect on local transportation, is not really what I'm after. And since the genocide partly overlaps with the growing season, I'm also controlling for rainfall in the village during the growing season, long-term rainfall, and the two interacted with rainfall, with distance to the main. And the identification assumption is going to be that conditional on those controls, the instrument only captures the malicious transportation costs. Okay. So for those of you who like to see regressions, so the reduced form, which I'm going to show you, is all the outcomes on the instrument, given the controls. And then in the second stage, I normalize the reduced form by the first standard. So here you have the first stage. In the first 3 columns, you see the number of militiamen as an outcome, external and local together. And he already suggests that places further away from the main road with more rainfall receive significantly fewer militiamen. Now, to argue that this is really, for once, picking up the external guys, I also find a strong negative effect when I look at mass graves. Mass graves are those where the external militia, National Army was likely active because those were the ones with grenades, machine guns that created huge massacre sites. Okay, I'll show you later on that I also have variation in the local perpetrators. There is no effect on mass graves there, something we wouldn't expect. Okay, so here are the main results. The red ones are the IV estimates. Let's focus on those. Each of these points is a separate regression. The outcomes are here. So since the DHS has a lot of questions, we sort of group them. First part will be stuff like education, wealth, health, financial autonomy, things like own a house, owns land, physical autonomy, things like teenage pregnancy, can refuse sex if husbands cheats, etc. Decision power, decides on large household purchases, decides on healthcare, sexual knowledge are things like knows about contraception, knows about the ovulatory cycle, fertility, things like wants more kids, less kids, etc. And so across the board, we find positive effects. We find negative effects on domestic violence, both when it comes to attitudes about domestic violence. So is it justified that your husband beats you or the kids? And experiencing domestic violence. And it seems to be especially driven by severe domestic violence. So things like threatening with a knife or strangling. Okay. So those would be the main results. Let's look at the mechanisms. And I argue in this part that these army militiamen targeted a specific subpopulation. Okay? And so how do I get to that? Philip Verwimp, who's a researcher in Belgium, has a paper on how people died. Unfortunately, only for one small province in Rwanda, so I can't use it, but it's still informative. And so he finds that women, the elderly, and children are more likely to die by a machete or a club, whereas adult men are more likely to die by a firearm or a grenade. Okay. Now, who owns firearms and grenades? These guys, the first ones. Okay. Who owns machetes and clubs? The local violence perpetrators. And so that instrument that induces armed group violence should also show in the age and gender composition. Okay. And so here I have, again, these are the outcomes. Each of these is a separate regression. The red ones are the IV estimates. So you see that experiencing more of these external violence increases the number of female heads, having a widow in the household, fraction of male goes down, fraction of adult males goes down. Okay. So consistent with that strategic killing, I should also argue, I forgot that at this point, that why would you target adult men with a firearm and a grenade? Well, if bullets are in short supply and you want to maximize the number of people killed, you would use bullets on those that are likely to fight back or escape adult men. So it was a strategic choice. We can further show that women not only take over as female household heads, they're also more likely to be local politicians. Once in office, they're also likely to be better educated. So not only do people vote more women into office, the ones that they vote for are also better educated. And it also translates into more local public goods provision. Okay. We can rule out a bunch of, I have 2 minutes?
2 more minutes, yeah.
Perfect. We can rule out a bunch of alternative mechanisms, selective killings based on human capital. So it's not that they killed all the smart women survived. Selective migration is not driving the results. Post-genocide reconstruction, so it could have been that right after the genocide, national NGOs, local NGOs, or the government went to all the high violence villages and invested a lot and then maybe overshot. That did not happen. And further, we can also rule out that in those places with a lot of external violence, people are more likely to vote for the RPF. That might be beneficial for them, if Kagame sends the money. We can rule that out as well. If we dig deeper, it seems to be that the effects are driven by younger women. not so much by older women. And let's skip the other two in the middle. Let me just talk about gender norms. Eventually, so when we measure these positive effects that are shown you there for the GHS and also the politicians, gender ratios have already normalized again, but the positive effects remain. Plus, men also change their attitudes, more female, pro-female. Okay? And so we argue in the paper, and there's a lot more in the paper, that gender norms changed and that these things might be relatively persistent. Okay, so let me, yeah, in local violence, so these guys, we use variation in RTLM radio coverage. I don't know if you know the paper by Yannick Savadra. That induced local violence. And we show that in those places, if anything, there were worse female outcomes. We can show that, yes, they targeted the elderly, women and children, that local violence. We find no effects on mass graves, local violence, small scale violence. And so to finish, policy recommendations, obviously, don't kill all the men, have a more positive takeaway, will be given women responsibility seems to work. I shouldn't write seems to work, I should just write works. It takes time, seems to be driven by younger generations. However, once in motion, the effects seem to be persistent. And so, since this is a conflict lecture or seminar, from a more conflict perspective, one of the takeaways might be that a one-size-fits-all approach to post-conflict reconstruction might be highly misleading, right? If you see a village that experienced a lot of violence, we really have to understand who perpetrated the violence to be able to really target help to the special needs of these villages. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Thorsten, and thanks a lot to the four presenters. They weren't always the easiest of topic to kick off the conference with, but you know, I'm sure we'll have some interesting discussions. So just maybe to get us started, Eva Maria had a question for James from the kind of first presentation. Eva Maria, do you want to go and ask your question?
Yes, so I was wondering about this measure of the caloric suitability index. Maybe I misunderstood that, but if I understand, it's based on today's crop potential, and it's used here to actually measure crop potential of land centuries ago. So I'm just wondering, by the moment you use land differently with different crops, land quality and land potential also changes. And maybe there's something else going on then that is being captured. And it's not just the fact that there are different crops suddenly available, but it's also something about how land can be used and how the land itself changes and its potential. If you could answer that, thanks.
Yeah, so I think the easiest first answer to give is to throw my hands up and say, yeah, well, but everybody else does it. In that people like Stelios Michaelopoulos have used similar measures to explain the spread of Islam over the same time scale. People like James Kung have used this for Ming-era China. It is the measure that exists at the grid cell level. In terms of it not capturing modern conditions, I'm much more worried about measurement error than I am about potential endogeneity, in that laterite is not going to become not laterite as a result of use, but climate might change. I suppose soil depth could respond, but if it's measurement error, if it's that soil type today is not, or soil quality today is not what it was in the past, that would just mean our results are too small. If there's endogeneity, I also imagine that would lead to an underestimate, in that if a cell is suitable for New World crops, and so you plant them, the most likely effect is to deplete soil fertility, meaning that when we get to the present day, we would be under-measuring the quality of these cells. And that, if systematically happens, I think would underestimate the effects that we find in our regressions.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm going to read a question from Christina for Eoin. So Christina is interested in future projections of the phenomenon you're looking at. And so what she wants to know is, can you make any future projections in the viability of transhuman pastoralism, food availability, and increased rates of conflict? Kind of an easy question for you to kind of, throw in at the end like that.
Yeah, thanks for teeing that up. Thank you, Christina. No, we haven't formally thought about future projections, but that would be definitely an interesting thing to do. One thing, just a word of caution, even a cautionary note to ourselves, is that the symbiotic relationship, like the cooperative equilibrium, is likely itself a product of violence over a very long period, which suggests that there probably is some adaptation. I don't have a good sense of how long that adaptation takes. I don't have a good sense of whether that adaptation can keep up with the pace of climate change. But that's one thing that would make this tricky. Another thing that I didn't quite have time to show you guys is when we account for the spillover mechanism of rainfall, we don't see any direct effect of rainfall on conflict. We see no own cell effect, no own group effect. The only negative impact of rainfall on conflict that we find is through that spillover mechanism. So that's something we're probably going to dig a little bit deeper into as well.
So next we'll have Rosanna, and then we'll have Anke Ofler. Basically, Rosanna was interested in whether you saw any differences in outcomes between Hutu and Tutsi women.
Yeah, that's a great question. The issue with it is after the genocide, the survey, any survey in Rwanda does not allow for that question anymore. So we don't know who's a Hutu and who's a Tutsi. So some people use certain proxies for it, age at first marriage and whatnot, but I'm not very convinced of those. And so unfortunately, it's all the women together. And there won't be any way to fix that.
Thanks for clarifying that. Anke, do you want to ask your question for Victoire?
Yes, thank you very much. So my question for Victoire, well, if I may, two quick questions. One is, how do you square your results with Dara Cohen's seminal work on sexual violence in war? And the other one is a more speculative one. So you show that this holds for gold. With the greening of our economies, we will need more rare earths, many of which are found in Africa, and how this is going to play out for violence and sexual violence. Thank you.
Thanks, Anke, for your questions. So our results in relation to those of Dara Cohen, indeed, you're right, I completely skipped the literature review. Basically, there's a quite big existing literature in political science that's really interested in what are the characteristics of the perpetrator groups. So what makes that a rebel group, an armed group, is going to resort to sexual violence or not. The way we're thinking about what we're doing, and that's what Dara Cohen is doing also, but we're thinking about what we're doing is really trying to be within this armed group level. So that's why we have this level of time varying fixed effect at the homeland level that account for the characteristic of the armed perpetrators that are present in that zone and that year, because even an armed group who perpetrates sexual violence is not going to perpetrate it in every day, in every place, in every village where it's present. So yeah, that would be the short. We really try to be within the armed group analysis. And then for the speculative part, that's a big question. And I guess what we hope to drag the attention to is that if there's really this strategic component, you can really avoid it by trying to, in the short run, send peace forces, or in the longer run, try to invest more into conflict-free minerals and the traceability of minerals. And there's many initiatives around that, including by the OECD. So I would hope that new mineral supply chains, like the one that are increasing around rare earths, do account for that. That's wishful thinking. Let's hope that can happen.
Thanks, Victoire. Now we have Joshua Shem, who has a question for Thorsten.
Yes, to Rogall, I wanted to ask a question concerning the, you look at the, hello, you get me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I wanted to confirm with you, you look at the genocide in Rwanda, the percent of women in the country during that time after the genocide was 70%, and women, men were only 30%. Now, my question is this: considering that a big role in restructuring the country to be stable economically. Now, assume there was no genocide, would there still be women empowerment? Because I just want you to confirm relative to other countries that have not experienced this with, I mean, political instability and economic instability, just considering and relatively comparing the same. Do you think Rwanda could still be having, could still be in top 10 countries in terms of women empowerment? Please.
That's a great question. Thank you very much. Sure. And that's a tough one. So given what I find, what we find, given all the anecdotal evidence that I've been reading on, my short answer would be, I don't think there would be the same level of empowerment than we see with the genocide. Okay, I think the genocide, killing all those, I mean, all of those things I say sound horrible now. Killing all those men, I think really is what empowered women, or gave, or not really, or forced them to be empowered. It was, if you read the anecdotal evidence, it was not really that they wanted it, but they were forced to take over responsibility. Okay, so that would be my short answer. Now the question could be, even if there were no genocide and Kagame would take over and sort of rely on women and push them, because it is true that he's doing that. My sense, again, from reading the anecdotal evidence, is that one of the reasons he's doing it or did it was because there was just no one else there. Okay, so if you go back and read accounts, there were just so few men to rely on that they had to use women. Okay, and so again, I think it would not have been possible without the genocide.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, it's clearly not an easy question to answer. Now we have Maxwell who has a question as well. Maxwell, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So it's a question to Eoin on the conflicts in the Sahel. I was just wondering whether you found differences between conflicts closer to the wetlands, like closer to rivers and lakes, as compared to other agricultural lands, because climate change may actually affect not just the migration of the pastoralists, but as well as the change in the agricultural location of agricultural production. So moving closer to the wetlands where the pastoralists graze as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maxwell. That's a great idea. So we can dig deeper and test for heterogeneity in those areas closer to wetlands and lakes. On your sort of second sub-point there, we are reading a lot in the case literature about the changing locations of agricultural production and how that could be causing conflict as well. So you could see agricultural encroachment facilitated by irrigation projects, by international NGOs and so on. Expanding agricultural production out onto areas that are typically used for pastoral groups, and I think getting a handle on that data, I think it will be really interesting. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
Actually, if I can kind of interject myself here, one thing I would also want to understand is kind of thinking about the adaptation. So you say you don't have direct evidence of it, but you now have kind of 30 years of data. And do you see that the effects kind of weaken through time while they're getting stronger? Maybe the shock's also not comparable, but that might be something interesting to kind of use that time dimension that you have that would be more difficult to get in other contexts.
I think what makes it complicated is that it's not a one-time shock. Climate change is severe and getting more severe, but point well taken. I see another question there, Julien, from Joanna. Will I address that as well?
So she's interested in understanding whether it would be possible to disaggregate the data on pre and post-harvest scenarios and their effect on conflict volatility rate in the region. She has more questions about kind of the political variables you mentioned at the end that you didn't really have time to go through, so maybe it's a bit of a chance to do that. And sorry, the question disappeared from the Q&A. I have to go and find it.
Yeah, I think I have a decent sense, so I can address both. So the first on pre and post harvest. So that's exactly what we do, Joanna. The story is that during the growing season, we have a joint use of resources, and that's where the conflict is concentrated. Then during the dry season, where we no longer have the joint use of resources, we're not seeing the conflict happening there at all. So we do separate the conflict by season in exactly the way that you suggest. So thank you for that. It's also true that there's just as much violence in general, unconditional probabilities. There's just as much violence in the dry season as there is in the wet season. So that result is not due just to the concentration of all the violence happening at one time of the year. To your second point, so we didn't have strong priors on whether the conflict would involve the state or not. It turns out in the data that it's all operating through conflict involving the state. So that's sort of why we then took to the political economy analysis to try to get a sense of what happens to this when pastoral groups share more power. And that's where the effect sort of tends to zero. So about your point on regulating sort of the right balance of grazing rights and cultivation rights, that seems to play, suggestively, it seems to play an important role.
Thanks. So Victoire, I just wanted to, if it's okay, I can ask a question as well. One thing I wanted to understand is,
sorry, it's just I didn't find where to type, but I had this question for Eoin too. Can I ask?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay,
go ahead.
thanks.
I too, if we have time left, we'll throw questions to the other panelists and have the same problem.
Okay, so I mean, I'm sure it's something you've thought about, but just to understand this choice of the closest neighbor, what was its motivation rather than using like a sort of buffer, or like how much do the groups typically commute, and why would it be only the closest neighbor rather than one that's like say within 50 kilometers or 100 kilometers? I have no clue what's a typical commute.
Yeah, so just doing the nearest neighbor means we can assign for every cell the nearest neighboring ethnic group. So if this effect is happening, we should be able to pick it up through this sort of mechanism. The distance of the nearest neighbor ranges from 0 kilometers to about 300 kilometers. So it's not a huge distance. And I think ultimately we're going to end up doing what you suggest. I'm sure a referee somewhere along the point will say, okay, can you just do this by buffers, and at what point does it dissipate? So I anticipate doing that exercise at some point.
James?
Right. So for Eoin, I had a debate with some historians maybe 10 years ago about exactly your data sources. That they think only economists would be naive enough to think that ethnicity is a fixed category that you can put on a map with stable boundaries, or that, and I've called these up, the Ethnographic Atlas and Human Relations Area Files, eerily suggestive of Vegematic commercials, possessing the taxonomic imperialism of the Victorian Zoological Garden, resembling a male butchering of the female corpus, could be used for colonial, imperialistic, corporate, and military ends, and reflect the work of ethnographers who write from positions of power, ignoring historical processes. I'm giving you the same question I basically got, but why should we use Murdoch's data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't have time to show this in the presentation. So we're not using the locations from the Ethnographic Atlas, but we are using the locations from Murdoch's map from a different book. So one way we can test this is we can look at Afrobarometer data and look at how people identify themselves, and we can see how that changes when you cross the borders in Murdoch's map. So that's something that my co-author has done in another paper on segmentary lineage and conflict in Econometrica this year with Jacob Mascana and James Robinson. And they find that the map does a pretty good job predicting the self-reported ethnicities of respondents in Afrobarometer. But I'm sure there are imperfections, obviously, and lots of measurement error, of course, and I guess it's the best we can do at the moment.
Great. Any more panelist questions? No? Okay. So, I mean, Eoin, I just wanted to ask you a question. So do you, sorry, maybe I've missed it. So you look at the shock in the neighboring area. Do you look at the interaction with the shock in your own area as well? So maybe if your shock is really bad and their shock is bad, then it really creates conflict. But if your shock is kind of a bit better, then there's a bit more stuff to bargain over, and they might not lead to as much conflict.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we control for own cell and own group shocks, but we don't look at the interaction of the shocks. And yeah, theoretically, I think it sounds like a good idea that could have some mitigating effect. Yeah, so that's something we can look at for sure.
Great.
I have a couple of questions for others if we have time, but if we don't have time, that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Finish now?
Yeah, you can ask. Go ahead.
Okay, and I know maybe we can take this offline afterwards, but there's lots of interesting things to talk about in all of these papers. Quick question for Thorsten. Thorsten, do we know anything about gender attitudes in Rwanda before the genocide? Because the comparison group effectively in your paper are still people who suffered through a genocide. It's hard to get a sense of where the effect is coming from. Is it coming from this or coming from this? So, I mean, I don't know if the data exists to get a sense of it.
I can give you one word: they were bad.
Yeah.
That across the board, what you read, very bad. So it's definitely an improvement, a big improvement.
All right. I mean, people can stay, but I just wanted to say that we've reached the end of the 90 minutes for this session. Thanks to everyone for attending. Thanks to all the panelists. I mean, I cannot use the clap thing on Zoom because I don't have access to the function, being the co-host, but thanks everyone, and I'll see most of you in 30 minutes, hopefully. Thanks.